All right, good morning, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on an oil painting, Young Love, Super Mario Brothers, and a suicide. All right, now yesterday it dripped very fortuitously. It created a figure, sort of a Picasso blue period looking slouching back and arm, and a face right here. So I'm going to start with those. I don't know if you can see that, but an eye, nose, sort of dissolving the upper portion of the face anyway. And then the figure, here's right shoulder, left shoulder, head, arm. So I'm going to exaggerate what's already there to start, and then build outward from those two elements.
Food writing, but also medicines in shipping containers destined for countries around the world. Even if the new administration wants to stop that program, you've already made the investment. You've spent the money appropriated by Congress to procure those antiretrovirals, to deliver them, and now people can't actually access them, and people will die. And it's not just about HIV, tuberculosis, malaria. We have an issue, the executive orders coming in January were concurrent with an Ebola outbreak in Uganda. So you're seeing the inability to do surveillance of outbreaks and to deal with emerging pandemics as well as HIV. And so you're seeing ramifications left, right, and center. We may not see the numbers tomorrow. People won't die tomorrow without antiretroviral therapy, but if they fall out of therapy, they will get sick. They're more likely to transmit the virus, and they will die. And we'll see those numbers coming up in the months and years ahead.
During his address to Congress on Tuesday night, President Trump highlighted several foreign aid cuts already made, including this one.
$8 million for making mice transgender. This is real.
In fact, it's not real. Rolling Stone and other outlets have documented that the funding Trump seems to have referred to was actually not for transgender mice, but for transgenic lab mice used in medical studies for cancer and asthma research. Mitchell Warren, if you can talk about the lies that have been perpetrated, going through to when Elon Musk was challenged, when his child was on his shoulders in the Oval Office, talking about when he had said that $50 million was going to Gaza for condoms, when told, no, in fact, that is a complete lie. That isn't true, that there were condoms going to the Gaza region of Mozambique. He said, okay, something like, we all make mistakes. But what this is meant to do when they continually ridicule, mock what they call corrupt programs that they're cutting, what in fact is happening, Mitchell?
What in fact is happening are lies to actually create a mythology amongst their supporters that foreign aid is somehow evil. Before January 20th, I would expect that 99% of Americans didn't even know what USAID was. Most people have now heard that acronym, but they don't actually know what it does. And for 60 years, it has provided immunization, disease surveillance, antiretroviral therapy, bed nets, condoms, in lots of places that are urgently needed to prevent infections and to prevent unintended pregnancy. And now we see these lies that are entire fabrications. And when I heard that speech and those lies, and I heard the laughter coming from our elected officials in Congress, I was appalled. And these are members of Congress who historically, across both parties, have supported foreign assistance, and to be laughing at what the president's making up. One of the things that was also remarkable, he criticized the investment of circumcision in Mozambique. And it showed the complete ignorance of this science. Voluntary medical male circumcision for 20 years has been proven to be one of the most effective forms of HIV prevention. It was actually studied with funding from the National Institutes of Health, a great example of NIH leadership in science. We've shown that circumcision prevents HIV infection by upwards to 70%. And now we have a president of the United States who mocks it as if it's a joke. It has saved lives. It's one of the most high-impact, cost-effective interventions. So there are lives, as you described, with transgenic mice that actually help advance the development of vaccines as well as cures. It is just a willful ignorance, a willful disregard of science, and an intentional effort to undermine democracy, frankly, because when you undermine science, when you undermine evidence, you're undermining democracy.
Very quickly, you're a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, known as PEPFAR, George W. Bush's project. Has the former president weighed in?
The George Bush Institute that is named for him in Texas has been a staunch supporter of PEPFAR and continues to explain what PEPFAR is doing, why it is the most data-driven, why it is the most evidence-based intervention we've seen, honestly, in the history of global health. And I hope that Democrats and Republicans, including Marco Rubio, it's important to note that Secretary of State Rubio, when he was Senator Rubio, was one of PEPFAR's biggest supporters. So we need to remind people what they said, what they believed, and to stop this willful disregard of congressional authority and of science.
And finally, to Nicholas Sansone. You're back in court today, right? You're back in the judge's court. And what is going to happen? What is the course of events now? Is it possible that even after the Supreme Court ruling that the president, that Elon Musk, won't have the $2 billion in funds unfrozen?
The court's order is clear. It's not optional at this point. The government must comply, and today in court we expect to make that case to the district judge, and we expect there to be clear steps laid out as to exactly what the government must do to lift this unlawful funding freeze while our case continues, and when the government must act by. So we will be speaking with the judge and with the government counsel this afternoon, and we expect to know more about what circumstances on the ground are going to look like after that.
Well, we'll continue to follow this, of course. Nicholas Sansone of Public Citizen Litigation Group, and Mitchell Warren, Executive Director of the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition. Coming up, internal memos show senior USAID leaders have warned Trump appointees that closing the agency will lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths. Stay with us. Kelso, Blue Sky by Rupert. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We continue to look at how the Trump administration's cuts to the U.S. Agency for International Development are likely to cause enormous human suffering, leading to increased death and disability, accelerated disease spread, political instability, and heightened threats to U.S. national security. That's according to internal USAID memos. One leaked memo has a chart for different program areas and the expected global case increase over 1 year if programs are permanently halted. For malaria, an additional 12.5 to 17.9 million cases, with up to 166,000 additional deaths each year. For tuberculosis, a 28 to 32% increase in estimated incidence globally. For Ebola, worst case scenario, more than 28,000 cases. Polio, an additional 200,000 paralytic polio cases a year over the next decade. The memo also projects 1 million children will lose treatment for severe acute malnutrition each year. It was written by USAID's Acting Assistant Administrator for Global Health, Nicholas Enrich. Over the weekend, Enrich was placed on administrative leave. For more, we're joined by Brett Murphy, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at ProPublica, where his new piece on this is headlined, "Internal Memos, Senior USAID Leaders Warn Trump Appointees of Hundreds of Thousands of Deaths from Closing Agency." Over the weekend, he also had a piece headlined, "The Trump Administration Said These Aid Programs Saved Lives. It canceled them anyway." Welcome back, Brett, to Democracy Now! So just lay out what you found, where these memos come from, how they got circulated, and also the fact that the person who wrote them was laid off. Not to mention, a few weeks ago, the Inspector General at USAID, who put out a report, was also laid off, or should we say fired.
Sure. So most of the agency at this point has been put on administrative leave. It's a skeleton staff there. And what's important to note where this is all coming from. For the past several weeks, the administration had said it's conducting this review of all of its programs at USAID. During this review, they effectively paused, halted almost everything that the agency had been funding. During that time, they said there was this waiver, they kept saying there was a waiver for life-saving programs. This caused confusion around the world because nobody knew if they qualified, if they did qualify, how to apply. So there's all this confusion, both internally and around the world.
Not to mention a lot of the international staff was told to get back to the United States.
Exactly, and nobody was able to communicate with the contractors and aid organizations who are doing this work, so they didn't know if they could qualify for this waiver. And at the same time, nobody was receiving money. So for work they'd already done, they weren't getting reimbursed. For new work, they weren't getting paid. Lots of confusion. And then at the agency, this Bureau, Global Health, was trying to put forth programs that they thought qualified for this waiver. They were making the case for each one of these individual programs, all the ones you just enumerated. Enrich and others were saying that lives depended on these, and this is not low-level staffers. These are the senior-most authorities in global health in the government, saying unequivocally, we are trying to implement the administration's own policy. The administration is saying publicly there should be a life-saving waiver for these programs. Let us do it. We want to apply the waiver. They were not allowed to apply the waiver. Time and again, they detailed in these memos different instances in which they wanted to conduct a review, put forth a program, and then get funding reinstated for those programs, but they weren't allowed to. And one of the incidents we reported on, there was a DOGE advisor who wrote to the Global Health Bureau and said, "We heard you guys are conducting a review. You should not be doing that. That's getting in the way of determinations. We want to terminate the programs." Another official, another political appointee at the agency said the same thing. He said, "We want to be draconian with how we're approaching these reviews. They want to err towards termination and not review." This is in stark contrast with what the administration has been saying, which is we want to conduct a careful case-by-case review of each one of these programs, and then if they don't align with the Trump administration's policy, we want to cut the programs. The evidence has been that they're doing the opposite, that they're cutting these en masse instead. That's what these memos detailed.
I mean, I remember when Elon Musk was in the White House, in the Oval Office, standing next to President Trump, and he said, for example, yeah, we cut Ebola, but then we restored it right away. But that's not what the experts are saying, the people involved with the programs.
I talked to a doctor in Uganda who was doing Ebola contamination. He told me we received a termination notice last week telling us to immediately seize all of our programs. They're one of very few clinics who are doing that work in Uganda. And he said we've had to close up shop. Hopefully the Ministry of Health in Uganda will take it over. But for them to say that they reinstated Ebola programs is categorically wrong, because we've talked to the mission directors who said that we cannot do the work, and our work is Ebola.
And why this matters, for example, with Ebola, why it matters to the people who are suffering from it there, and why it matters to people in the United States.
The work they do, and people will remember, I think, some of these terms from the COVID era, like contact tracing, screening at airports. This is the work that they do. They figure out this is how you contain an outbreak, something as deadly as Ebola, which has something like a 50% fatality rate. Around the country, they contain the spread of a disease like that, so it doesn't make its way to an airport, so it doesn't make its way stateside. That's the type of work that they do. It's literally life-saving work.
Talk about tuberculosis.
Same with TB. TB is a respiratory illness, just like COVID is, and it doesn't get talked about quite as much as HIV or Ebola, but we've been speaking with doctors and longtime aid groups who've been in Africa who said this is their real concern. We are cutting TB work. The outbreaks could be enormous on a scale that they haven't seen in decades. And this is sort of, one of the tentpoles of USAID has been TB containment in Africa, and they're extremely worried about it.
So explain what happened to Nicholas Enrich, who wrote these memos, and how the administration has responded now that this information has gotten out, and they've been warned hundreds of thousands of people will die, as President Trump mocks transgender mice, which wasn't even true. That's become sort of the symbol of USAID, and also the Inspector General before him.
They've erected certain examples like this throughout. They did it before, as you were mentioning, with the condoms in Gaza. Your other guest made the point that the administration has the purview to look at certain programs and decide whether or not they align with the policy. That's just not what they've been doing. It's just not what's been happening. They cut everything at once, and now they're actually in the process of reversing some of those terminations. They seem to be unsure of what they cut. They've been soliciting information from their own contract officers, from aid organizations, asking if their program got cut, so they seem to be reversing. We did another story a couple days ago about they went after programs inside of the Inspector General's office, which USAID does not have control over. The IG's office is independent, it has to be. So just as an example of kind of what has been described as a haphazard and kind of chaotic process, they cut the cell phone service of Inspector General officials throughout the agency, including the ones based overseas, Haiti and Ukraine. For 24 hours, nobody had cell phone service because they cut the contract with AT&T over an office that they do not have control over. So people have been making the case to me for weeks now that this is the opposite of a careful review. And they've been saying in court, this is a careful review. We're allowed to do a careful review. Everyone at the agency and everyone who's had their programs cut says obviously it's not a careful review because they're making mistakes and they're overturning their own terminations. They seem unclear of it now. So they just cut everything at once and now they're going backwards.
And it's very difficult to get back in touch, especially with their own workers, because when they fire them, they cut off their email. And so then they don't know how to reach them.
These people on administrative leave across the agency have had their access to the systems completely cut off. So we're talking about most of the workforce at this agency, the ones who would be doing the work of like helping these programs get back online, they're not able to work right now. They're not working. They're effectively dismissed. So there's really nobody to help these programs get back online and improve the payments that they need.
I want to ask you about one particular man. As part of the Trump administration's push to cut U.S. foreign aid, DOGE announced Tuesday it had cut the staff for the Inter-American Foundation from 48 workers to 1. The agency's newly installed head, Trump loyalist Peter Morocco, acting deputy administrator for USAID. Morocco was reportedly part of a closed-door meeting Wednesday with members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and told them the administration may bring criminal referrals against workers at USAID over allegations of misuse of foreign assistance. Also Wednesday, staff at the U.S. African Development Foundation reportedly blocked DOGE staffers from entering their office, where Trump is also trying to install Pete Morocco to gut the agency. So, Brett, you have reported on Peter Morocco in a story headlined, "Trump Official Destroying USAID Secretly Met with Christian Nationalists Abroad in Defiance of U.S. Policy." As we begin to wrap up, lay out what you found.
This was back in 2018. Previous Trump administration, Pete Morocco was at the State Department. He had done short stints at multiple agencies, DOD, USAID, Commerce, and State. He was over there on a diplomatic mission to Bosnia-Herzegovina. left the reservation without talking to the ambassador, and met with Serb separatists inside of Bosnia-Herzegovina, including the president Milorad Dodik. At the time, Dodik was under U.S. sanctions by the Trump administration for trying to undermine the peace agreements that we very carefully drew up in the 90s after the genocide. After David Cordes, yes. Milorad Dodik had been accused of undermining these. He has said publicly he's anti-American.
Alright, so that defines the slouching bluish figure and starts developing the face sort of embedded or dissolving through it. Yeah, so we'll develop it from there. That's it for the moment, though. Thank you. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting Young Love, Super Mario Brothers, and a suicide. Have a good day, Earth.